The reed boat split apart on a submerged snag with a sound like a bone breaking, and Ursa Doomhammer went into the black water with it. She had crossed worse floods than this, had swum rivers running with ice, had waded chest-deep through mud while arrows hissed past her ears, but never with her wrists still bound in the ceremonial silver wire of a bride price contract, and never with 3 of her honor guard already swallowed by the dark somewhere behind her. The storm had come out of nowhere an hour past dusk, turning the delta's quiet channels into a churning maze of collapsing levees and rising black water. And now, the only sound in the world was rain hammering the marsh grass and her own ragged breath as she fought her way toward a smear of lantern light in the distance. She lost her boots to the mud. She lost the fine, woven mantle her father had draped over her shoulders with his own hands, the one meant to announce to the humans of Duskwater Landing that a Doomhammer had come among them in peace. She did not lose her knife, because she had sewn it into her boot herself as a girl learns to do, and she did not lose the small, foolish, half-forgotten hope that had been sitting under her ribs since her father first spoke the name of the town she was being sent to, Duskwater Landing. She had not let herself think about who still lived there. The current dragged her sideways into a stand of reeds, and she clawed her way up a slick timber piling, hand over hand, boots gone, palms tearing, until she was hauling herself onto a plank walkway that groaned under her weight. Lightning tore the sky open above the stilt houses, and for one white-lit heartbeat she saw the whole ragged shape of the town houses on legs like wading birds, walkways strung between them, boats knocking together in their moorings. And then the dark swallowed it again and she was crawling, not walking, toward the one light that had not gone out. It was a low building at the edge of the causeway, built lower and sturdier than the houses around it, with a chimney breathing sparks into the storm and the unmistakable orange glow of a forge fire seeping out from under its shutters. She did not choose it because she recognized it. She told herself that later more than once and never quite believed herself. Her strength ran out 3 steps from the door. Charles Fletcher heard something fall against his workshop wall like a dropped sack of grain, and at first he thought it was a loose shutter or a fishing net torn free by the wind. He had been up long past a sensible hour, quenching a blade that could not wait for kinder weather, and it was only when the sound came a second time, lower and more human, more like a groan than a knock, that he set down his tongs and crossed the floor with a lantern raised. He opened the door into a wall of rain and found a shape slumped against his porch post, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, far too tall to be anyone from the town, soaked through so completely that the water ran off her in sheets even as the storm kept adding more. For one confused moment he thought he had found a wounded soldier, some straggler from a border skirmish washed all the way down the delta, and he was already reaching to check for a pulse at her throat when the lantern light caught the curve of her jaw, the pale scar above one dark brow, the unmistakable, proud, tusked profile that had haunted the back of his mind for 10 long years. His hand went still. The wind screamed through the gap in the door. Rain lashed sideways across the porch, and the woman in front of him stirred, lifted her head an inch off the boards and looked at him with eyes the color of river stone, glassy with exhaustion but still, even now, still fierce. Charles did not say her name. He did not trust his voice to carry it without breaking, and some old instinct, worn smooth by years of solitary work, told him that whatever this moment was, it did not need words yet. He set the lantern down, ducked back inside for 3 steps, and came out again with the good towel, the thick one he kept folded on a shelf for washing quench oil off his hands, and he knelt on the wet boards and draped it around her shoulders with hands that were not quite steady. She flinched at the touch, then did not. Her fingers, when they finally curled into the fabric, were shaking so hard the towel trembled with them. He got an arm under her and hauled her up, and she came, unsteady, leaning into him with a weight that told him plainly how far past her limits she had gone, and he walked her through his own door into the warm orange dark of the forge room, past the hissing quench trough, to the bench near the fire. And only then, only when he had her sitting, only when the towel was tucked properly around her shoulders and her chattering teeth had slowed, did he trust himself to speak. "Ursa," he said, and his voice cracked clean in half on the second syllable. "Ursa Doomhammer." She looked up at him through wet lashes, water still running from her hair down the strong line of her throat, and something in her face that had been braced for a stranger's cruelty simply came undone. "Charles Fletcher," she said, and her voice was a low, rough thing, worn down by the storm and the years both. "You still keep the fire too hot in here. I could feel it from the causeway." He laughed once, a broken and disbelieving sound, and sat down hard on the bench across from her because his knees had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The rain hammered the shutters. The forge fire popped and settled. And between them, unspoken and enormous, sat 10 years that neither one of them had ever quite managed to bury. She had left the Duskwater Delta at 19 summers old, called back to her clan's war camps in the high country when the border skirmishes flared again, and he had been a smith's apprentice of 21, too poor and too ordinary to matter to anyone but himself, and the two of them had spent one whole storm season pretending that none of that mattered, that a Doomhammer clan daughter and a human bladesmith's boy could simply exist together in the reeds and the rain without the world noticing. The world had noticed. Her father had forbidden it the moment word reached him. The treaty of that time had forbidden it worse, on pain of exile for her and worse for him. She had gone north with her honor guard in a gray dawn without saying goodbye, because saying goodbye would have meant admitting there was something worth grieving, and Charles Fletcher had spent the next decade forging other men's swords and telling himself he had imagined the whole of it. He had not imagined it. Sitting across from her now, watching her shiver less and less as the fire did its slow work, he knew with a certainty that frightened him how little of it he had managed to forget. "You're the bride," he said finally, because someone had to say the ugly, obvious thing out loud, and it might as well be him. "The one the council's been fussing over for a month. The Doomhammer bride come to marry into Duskwater Landing and seal the Delta Treaty. I am." Her jaw tightened. "My father agreed to send me. A gesture of good faith, he called it. 10 years since the last blood was spilled over the salt flats, and the humans wanted proof the peace would hold past his lifetime." She looked down at her raw, mud-streaked hands. "I did not know the name of the man I was to marry until we were 3 days into the crossing. Silas Vane." Charles felt something cold settle low in his gut that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Vane," he said. "You're to marry Silas Vane. You know him. Everyone in this town knows him." Charles chose his next words carefully, aware suddenly of how much weight they might carry. "He owns half the salt flat leases and most of the council's ear besides. He is not a kind man, Ursa. I would not wish him on anyone, and I would wish him on you least of all." She studied him for a long moment, water still dripping from the ends of her dark hair onto the towel, onto the bench, onto the floor he would mop in the morning without once minding the mess. "You always did say exactly what you thought," she said, "even when it cost you something to say it." "It's cost me plenty over the years," he admitted. "Never regretted it, though, not with you." Something passed over her face then, quick and unguarded, gone before he could name it. She pulled the towel tighter around her shoulders instead of answering, and outside the storm rolled on, indifferent to either of them, and inside the forge fire burned steady and low, and for the first time in 10 years Charles Fletcher let himself believe that some old, unfinished thing between them was not, after all, over. The morning after the storm broke clear and merciless bright, the kind of sun that made the whole delta steam like a kettle left too long on the coals, and Duskwater Landing turned out in force to see the Doomhammer bride formally presented before the council. Ursa stood at the edge of the town's moot platform, a broad stilted plaza that jutted out over the widest channel in the delta, its planks silvered with age and salt, and she stood there in her own dried travel leathers, the fitted jerkin of dark-tanned hide laced snug across her chest, the cream linen shirt beneath it gone soft and pale from the river, the wide belt with her clan's hammer-sigil buckle cinched at her waist, breeches tucked into borrowed boots since her own were lost to the flood. And she held her chin up under the weight of 200 staring strangers, as if she had chosen every one of them to be there. Charles stood near the back with the other tradesmen, close enough to see her face and far enough that no one would think twice about it, and he watched Silas Vane cross the platform toward her with the easy, proprietary stride of a man inspecting livestock he had already purchased. Vane was tall, handsome in the way that money makes a man handsome, dressed in good Delta linen dyed a deep council blue, and he looked Ursa over from her borrowed boots to her rain-tangled hair with an expression that made Charles's hands curl into fists at his sides. "They tell me your escort was lost in the flood," Vane said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, pitched with just enough false concern to sound like courtesy and just enough carelessness to make it clear he felt none. "How unfortunate! I trust the swim did not damage the goods." A ripple of low laughter went through part of the crowd. Ursa did not so much as blink. "3 of my honor guard are missing in that flood," she said, and her voice carried across the whole platform without needing to be raised. "Good warriors, sworn to my father, drowned or lost somewhere in your delta because a storm caught us in the wrong channel. If you wish to speak of unfortunate, Master Vane, speak of them. Do not speak of me as though I were cargo that arrived light on the manifest." The laughter died. Somewhere behind Charles, an old woman muttered something about orc tempers, and a younger man beside her shifted uneasily, and Charles felt the whole crowd's mood tilt, uncertain, toward wariness, the old prejudice, worn thin by years of uneasy peace but never quite gone, rising up in a dozen small looks and murmurs. Elder Osgood Marsh, gray-bearded and sun-browned, stepped forward from the council table with the weary patience of a man who had presided over 100 such tense moments before. "Peace," he said, raising both hands. "Peace, all of you. We are gathered to honor a treaty 10 years in the keeping, not to trade insults over a storm none of us could have stopped." He turned to Ursa and inclined his head, a genuine courtesy, the first Charles had seen offered to her since she'd arrived. "Doomhammer's daughter, Duskwater Landing thanks you for the crossing you endured and grieves with you for your lost guard. We will send searchers along the channels at first light." "My thanks, Elder," Ursa said, and some of the iron went out of her shoulders just slightly, just enough for Charles to see. Vane recovered his composure with the smoothness of a man well practiced at it. "Of course," he said. "Of course. Forgive me, I only meant to lighten a grim morning." He offered Ursa his arm, and she looked at it the way she might have looked at a snake sunning itself on a warm rock, and did not take it. Vane's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, and Charles filed that look away without knowing yet why it mattered. "There is the matter of the binding blade," Elder Marsh said, moving the ceremony along before the silence could curdle further. "Custom holds that the groom's household commission a blade from the town smith, forged and gifted to the bride before the rite, as a pledge of the strength that will stand behind her in her new home." He glanced around the platform. "Master Fletcher, step forward." Charles felt every eye on the platform swing toward him at once, and he crossed the boards with his heart hammering harder than it had any right to, and when he stopped in front of Ursa, close enough to see the fine tremor still lingering in her hands from the night before, close enough to smell rain and river mud still clinging faintly to her hair, he had to work to keep his own voice level. "I'll need to take the measure of your grip," he said, "for the balance." "I remember how you work, Charles Fletcher," she said quietly, so quietly that only he could hear it over the murmuring crowd. "You always did take your time." He did not trust himself to answer that. He took her hand instead, careful, professional, turning it palm up in the bright morning sun to study the calluses at the base of her fingers. The strength coiled in that hand even now, exhausted as she was, and he told himself firmly that this was simply his work, the same work he had done for 100 customers before her, and he did not believe a word of it, and neither, from the way her breath caught almost silently when his thumb traced the length of her palm, did she. The forge became, over the days that followed, the one place in Duskwater Landing where Ursa Doomhammer did not have to hold her chin up against a room full of wary strangers. And so, she came often, ostensibly for the fittings that a ceremonial blade required, and Charles found himself inventing reasons to need her there longer than any blade had ever truly demanded. "The grip again," he said on the third morning, when the true measurements had long since been taken and recorded in chalk on his workbench, and Ursa arched one dark brow at him across the anvil but held out her hand anyway, and he wrapped his fingers around hers to test the weight of the half-finished hilt, and let the moment stretch a full breath longer than it needed to. "You have measured this hand 4 times now," she said, not pulling away. "I begin to think you are stalling, Smith." "Might be." He turned her hand slightly, angling it toward the light as though the angle mattered, watching the way the forge glow caught along her knuckles. "Might be I've forgotten how you take up a grip after 10 years, and I'm having to relearn it slow." "You have not forgotten anything," she said low, and there was something in the way she said it that was not quite an accusation and not quite an invitation, but hung somewhere charged and trembling between the two. He looked up from her hand to her face and found her already watching him, her gray eyes steady and searching, and for one long moment neither of them moved, close enough over the anvil that he could feel the warmth radiating off her, close enough that if either of them leaned an inch further the space between them would simply cease to exist. The bell over his shop door clattered as a customer pushed it open, and they both stepped back at the same instant, and Ursa turned to study the row of finished blades hanging on the wall with an interest so sudden and so total that Charles almost laughed despite the way his heart was still slamming against his ribs. "You've gotten better," she said, once the customer had gone and the shop was quiet again, nodding at the blades. "Your father's work was fine. Yours is finer. You remember my father's work." "I remember everything about that summer, Charles Fletcher." She said it plainly, without softness, the way she might report troop movements or weather. "I have simply had 10 years of practice pretending I do not." He set down the half-finished hilt with hands that had gone unsteady, and he crossed the small space between them before he had fully decided to do it, and stopped himself a hand's breadth away, close enough to see her pulse beating fast in her throat, close enough that the old ache in his chest had become something sharper, more urgent, more dangerous than mere longing. "I never stopped," he admitted, low and rough. 10 years, and I never once stopped." Her hand came up slow and rested flat against his chest, not pushing him away, not pulling him closer, simply resting there as though she needed to feel his heart hammering under her palm to believe any of this was real. "Charles," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded like it cost her something to say. "I am promised to another man in 9 days' time. I know it. I do not intend to let that stop me from wanting what I want," she said, and there was iron in it, the old fierce Doomhammer pride surfacing even here, even now. "But I will not shame either of us by taking what I cannot yet keep, not until I know what road we are truly walking." He stepped back because she asked it of him without asking, and he understood some things worth having were worth waiting for properly, even when the waiting felt like a blade twisting slow between his ribs. "Then we walk it slow," he said, "however long it takes." She looked at him for a long moment, something unbearably soft moving behind the fierceness in her eyes, and then she picked up the half-finished hilt from the bench and turned it over in her hands with the careful reverence of a woman who understood exactly what it meant that he was forging her wedding blade with his own 2 hands while wanting, with his whole chest, for the wedding never to happen at all. The market square of Duskwater Landing sat on the widest of the stilted platforms, ringed with stalls selling smoked eel and reed-woven baskets and bright bolts of dyed cloth. And it was there, 6 days after the storm, that the town's uneasy tolerance finally cracked open in front of everyone. Ursa had gone to the market alone that morning, insisting she did not need an escort, and Charles had let her go because he understood, better than most, how much it cost her pride to be shadowed everywhere like a prisoner. He was 3 stalls down, haggling with a leather merchant over a bolt of good hide, when he heard the first raised voice. "Don't want her kind touching my fish," a heavy-set fishwife was saying, loud and sharp, one hand planted on her hip and the other pointing at a basket of silver-scaled eel that Ursa had simply been examining with the same careful, unhurried interest she brought to everything. "Get your green hands off my catch before you spoil it." "I have not touched your catch," Ursa said calm, though Charles, already turning, already moving, could hear the edge under the calm. "I was looking. That is all I have done." "Looking's enough," someone else called from further down the row, and then it was not just the fishwife anymore. It was 3, 4, half a dozen voices rising together, old fear and older grudges surfacing all at once the way they will in a crowd that has found a single, safe target to aim them at. A boy threw a fish head, more out of excitement than malice, and it struck Ursa's shoulder and slid down the front of her leathers, and the crowd's ugly laughter at that landed harder on Charles's ears than any blow could have. He was moving before he had decided to, shoving between 2 startled onlookers, and he put himself squarely between Ursa and the fishwife's stall with his arms spread and his voice pitched to carry. "That's enough," he said. "That is enough, all of you. She is a guest under this town's own treaty, sent here in good faith, and I will not stand here and watch her pelted with fish guts in the middle of your market." "Fletcher, stay out of it," someone warned. "This isn't Smith's business." "It is exactly my business," Charles said, and something in his voice quiet, unshakable, the voice of a man who had spent a decade being overlooked and had finally found something worth being loud about, made even the fishwife go still. "I have forged half the blades hanging in this market, mended half your plowshares, shoed half your boat hooks, and not one of you has ever once asked whether my hands were fit to touch your goods. Hers are steadier than mine ever were. Shame on the lot of you." The crowd's murmur faltered, uncertain now, some faces flushing with embarrassment, others still hard with old distrust. It was into that uncertain silence that a heavier man shoved forward from the back one of Vane's dock foremen. Charles recognized him and grabbed Charles hard by the shoulder, spinning him half around. "You'd take an orc side over your own town, Smith." Charles never got the chance to answer. Ursa moved faster than the man could track, one hand closing around his wrist with a strength that made him gasp and drop instantly to one knee, and she leaned down close to his ear, her voice gone low and terribly calm. "You will take your hand off him," she said, "or I will take it off at the wrist. Choose quickly." The foreman let go. He stumbled back into the crowd, cradling his arm, and the whole market square went dead silent. 200 people watching an orc woman stand protectively over a human bladesmith with her jaw set, and her eyes daring anyone else to try their luck. And Charles, straightening his shoulder, found himself struck less by fear than by a fierce, unfamiliar gladness that took his breath away worse than the shove had. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly, once the crowd had begun reluctantly to disperse. "I know I did not need to." She looked at him, something raw and open in her face for just a moment before the fierce composure settled back over it. "I wanted to." "There is a difference, Charles Fletcher, and you had best learn it because I do not intend to stop." He walked her back to the forge through streets gone quiet with a shame that would, he suspected, linger longer in some hearts than others, and he did not let go of her hand the whole way, and she did not pull it back. Silas Vane found out about the market 3 hours later, and he did not come to the forge to shout. He came instead to Ursa's rented room above the guest house near the moot platform, and Charles, arriving with a fitted scabbard he had promised to deliver that evening, heard the low, venomous edge of Vane's voice through the half-open shutters before he ever reached the door. "Do you think it looks to have my bride defended in the marketplace by a common bladesmith, as though she cannot manage her own affairs?" "I managed my own affairs quite well," Ursa said, and Charles, standing on the walkway outside, saw her through the gap in the shutters, arms crossed, chin lifted, entirely unbowed. I had already dealt with the foreman before Fletcher arrived. He simply refused to leave well enough alone. Fletcher. Vane said the name like something distasteful caught in his teeth. You would do well to remember what you are here for, Doomhammer's daughter. You are not here to make friends among the tradesmen of this town. You are here to be my wife and to remind the Delta clans that peace is more profitable than war, nothing more. I am here, Ursa said, and her voice went dangerously quiet, because my father believed you were a man of honor. I begin to think he was mistaken. Vane laughed, short and ugly. Honor, he said. Careful, my dear beast bride. Honor is a fine word for a woman with none of her own left to spend, consorting with common smiths behind her betrothed's back. Charles's hand found the doorframe before he had decided to move, and it was only Ursa's sharp, warning glance through the gap in the shutters. A look that said clearly, not yet, not here, let me asterisk, that kept him rooted where he stood. You will not speak to me of honor, Ursa said, stepping close enough to Vane that Charles saw the man actually flinch back half a step. When I have already heard, from 3 separate mouths in this town, that you bribe councilmen and cheat leaseholders and treat every soul beneath your notice like something to be used and discarded. I have not touched Charles Fletcher with anything but my own hand, and even if I had, it would be no business of a man who speaks to me the way you have just spoken. Get out of my room, Master Vane, before I decide the treaty is not worth the insult. Vane's face had gone dark and tight, but he mastered it, forced something almost like a smile back onto his mouth. 9 days, he said, backing toward the door. In 9 days you will be my wife, and you will learn to hold your tongue, or I will teach you the value of a quiet mouth myself. He pushed past Charles on the walkway without a second glance, as though he were beneath noticing, and disappeared down the boardwalk toward the town center. Charles stood frozen for a moment, fury and fear tangled together so tightly in his chest he could hardly breathe. And then Ursa was in the doorway, pulling him inside by the front of his shirt, and the moment the door shut behind them she was in his arms, or he was in hers. Neither of them ever quite agreed afterward on who had moved first. I am not afraid of him, she said fiercely, her face pressed close to his, her hands fisted in the front of his shirt. But I am afraid, Charles Fletcher, of 9 days from now, of standing in front of this whole town and swearing myself to a man who looks at me the way he looks at a lease he intends to squeeze dry. Then don't, he said low, his hands coming up to cradle her face, rough thumbs brushing along her jaw. Ursa, don't. It is not so simple as don't, she said, but her voice had gone soft, and her eyes had gone soft, and the storm outside, because of course the storm had returned, thunder rolling low over the delta again as though the sky itself had a memory for this particular story pressed against the shutters like something wanting in. I know it, he said. I know it isn't simple. I have spent 10 years learning exactly how unsimple it is, and I still came back here every single day this week to measure your hand around a grip I didn't need to measure 4 times because I would rather have an hour of you than a lifetime of anyone else. Her breath caught. Charles, tell me to stop, he said, and I will, but I don't think you want me to. No, she said, and the word came out rough and curt. No, I do not want you to stop. He kissed her then, finally, after 10 years and 9 days, and a lifetime of careful hands measuring things that had never truly needed measuring, and she kissed him back with a fierceness that nearly knocked him off balance, one hand fisted in his hair, the other flat against his chest, as though she were still checking to be sure his heart was real. And outside the second storm broke wide open over Duskwater Landing, rain hammering the shutters exactly as it had the night she'd arrived, and neither of them noticed, or cared or stopped. Word of the market brawl and the shouting match at the guest house reached Silas Vane's ears within the day, twisted and embellished by the time it did, and whatever restraint he had been holding onto broke entirely 3 mornings later when he burst into a hastily called council session with his steward at his heels, and his face gone white with rage. I demand a hearing, he said, before Elder Marsh had even finished calling the session to order. "The Doomhammer bride has dishonored our betrothal. She has been seen in private, repeatedly, with another man, the smith, Charles Fletcher, in violation of every custom her own clan holds sacred. I invoke the orc right of trial. Let her honor be settled before witnesses, as her own people would demand, or let this treaty be declared broken by her conduct." A ripple of shock went through the gathered council, and the crowd that had followed Vane in, murmurs rising fast and ugly. Charles, seated near the back where he had come hoping only to hear the day's ordinary business, felt the floor seem to tilt under him. Ursa rose from her seat at the front of the hall, and if she felt any fear, she did not show a trace of it. "You know nothing of my people's customs, Sela's Vane," she said, "if you think to twist them into a leash for your own convenience." "I know enough," Vane said, and there was something too smooth, too rehearsed in the way he said it. "I know that among the clans a bride whose faith is questioned may demand or be forced to endure a trial by combat to prove before all witnesses that her honor and the honor of the match still stands unbroken. I demand that trial. If she is truly faithful, truly worthy of my house, she will have no fear of it. And if I refuse," Ursa's voice did not waver. "Then the treaty is void by your own conduct," Vane said, spreading his hands as though the matter pained him deeply. "And your clan bears the shame of a broken bargain before the whole Delta." "I do not think your father would thank you for that, Doomhammer's daughter." Elder Marsh, gray and grave at the head of the council table, held up a hand for silence, though it took a long moment for the hall to quiet enough to obey him. "This is no small accusation," he said. "Trial by combat is no custom of this town, but if it is truly the orc right the lady's own clan would recognize, then perhaps it is the only path that satisfies both sides. Lady Doomhammer, is this a true right of your people?" Ursa's jaw was tight, but she did not lie. "It is," she said. "Among my clan, when a bride's faith is challenged before a binding, she may answer the challenge in combat herself or through a chosen champion, against the accuser's own champion. If she or her champion prevails, her honor stands proven beyond further question, and the accuser may make no further claim upon her. If she is defeated, she is judged faithless, and the betrothal stands broken in shame, with the bride's own clan bearing the dishonor of it." "Then I name my champion," Vane said quickly, before anyone else could speak, and there was a hungry, satisfied edge to his voice now that made Charles's stomach turn over. "Grath Ironjaw, a mercenary of considerable renown, presently in my employ and no stranger to the blade." A murmur went through the hall. Charles had heard the name, a hulking orc exile who had fought in a dozen border conflicts and lost none of them, a man twice Ursa's weight and by every account without mercy in him. "And who," Vane asked, turning to Ursa with a thin, satisfied smile, "will stand as your champion, Doomhammer's daughter? You are, as I understand it, 3 guards short, thanks to the storm." The hall went silent. Ursa's eyes swept the room once briefly, and Charles saw the flicker of calculation in them, measuring, weighing, deciding before she spoke. "I need no champion," she said, loud enough to carry to every corner of the hall. "I will fight for my own honor with my own hands. That is my right under my own clan's law, and no man in this room may deny it to me." Elder Marsh looked for a moment almost sorrowful. "So be it," he said quietly. 6 days hence, on the moot platform before this council and this town, may whatever truth lies between you be settled honestly." Charles walked Ursa home from the council hall in a silence too heavy for words, past townsfolk who watched them go with faces caught between pity and suspicion, and it was not until they had reached the guest-house door that she finally spoke. "Grath Ironjaw has killed 6 men in the arena pits at Blackreed Crossing," she said quietly. "I have heard the stories since I was a girl." "Then we make sure you're better than the stories," Charles said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "Come to the forge tonight. I'm not giving you a ceremonial blade to fight him with. I'm giving you a real one." She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and frightened all tangled together in her face. And then she nodded once, and followed him back through the rain-slick streets toward the one light in Duskwater Landing that had never once gone out for her. The forge fire burned all through that night, and most of the 5 that followed it, and Charles worked the steel the way his father had taught him, and the way no one had ever taught him at all, by feel, by instinct, by the fierce and desperate need to put something true into Ursa Doomhammer's hands before she walked out onto that platform to fight for her life. He folded the metal a dozen times more than the ceremonial blade had called for, working out every flaw, every weakness, quenching and tempering with a care that left his shoulders aching and his eyes burning from the smoke. Ursa sat with him through most of those nights, sharpening her own knife, watching his hands move over the steel with an attention that had nothing to do with the blade and everything to do with the man shaping it. "You should sleep," she told him on the 4th night, when the shadows under his eyes had gone dark as bruises. "So should you," he said, without looking up from the tang he was fitting to the hilt. "You've a fight in 2 days." "I have fought on less sleep than this," she said, and then, quieter, "I would rather spend the hours I have with you than waste them dreaming, Charles Fletcher." He set down his file and looked at her properly then, across the workbench, the forge fire painting her face in gold and shadow, and something in her expression open, unguarded, terrified in a way she would never have allowed the rest of the town to see, undid the last of his careful restraint. "Come here," he said low, and she came around the bench into the circle of his arms, and he held her the way he had wanted to hold her every single day of the 10 years she'd been gone, tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest, steady despite everything. "If I lose," she said into his shoulder, "you must not try anything foolish. Promise me. Vane will have no more use for me if I am dishonored, and my father's men will come to take me home in shame, and you will still have your forge, your town, your life. Promise me you will let it be." "I can't promise you that," he said honestly, "because it would be a lie, and I have never once lied to you." He pulled back just far enough to look at her properly. "But I can promise you this. You are not going to lose." She kissed him then, slow and fierce and unhurried despite the hour, despite the fight 2 days off, despite everything hanging over both their heads, and when she finally drew back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears she refused, stubbornly, to let fall. "There is a custom," she said quietly, "among my people. When a warrior chooses her own heart over the match her clan has arranged, she marks the man she has chosen before witnesses if she is brave enough, or in private if she is not yet ready for the world to know. A claiming mark. It is not lightly given." "Give it to me, then," Charles said, without a moment's hesitation. "However you're ready to give it." She drew the small knife from her boot, the same one she had sewn into the leather as a girl, the one that had survived the flood when nothing else of her old life had, and she drew it lightly, so lightly it barely stung, along the pad of her own thumb, and pressed the small bead of blood against the base of his throat, just above his collarbone, in a mark no bigger than a fingerprint. "There," she said, low, her voice rough with feeling. "Now you are claimed, Charles Fletcher, whatever comes of the platform in 2 days' time. Whatever Vane calls me, whatever this town believes, you are mine, and I do not give that lightly, and I do not intend to lose you now that I have finally taken it back." He caught her hand and pressed his lips to the small cut on her thumb, and then to her palm, and then, unable to help himself, to her mouth again, and the forge fire burned low and warm around them as the night went on, gentle now where it had been urgent, unhurried where the days ahead promised nothing but urgency. And when at last they lay together in the small room behind the workshop, wrapped in each other with the storm long since past, and the stars showing thin and clear through a gap in the shutters, there was nothing performed or careful about it. Only 2 people who had loved each other for a decade without daring to say so, finally, quietly, entirely certain. The morning after was not gentle at all. Charles woke before dawn to the sound of a fist pounding on his workshop door and found Jory Ames, a young dockhand he'd known for years, standing soaked and out of breath on his porch. "Master Fletcher," Jory said, "you'd best come. Old Tolliver washed up 2 nights past, half drowned, at my uncle's landing downriver. He's been raving something about the storm, about the escort boats, about Vane's steward paying him coin to run them into the flood channel on purpose. My uncle didn't credit it, figured the old man's wits were addled from the near drowning, but I heard the name Doomhammer in it, and I thought you ought to know. Charles felt something cold and sharp cut through the last fog of sleep. "Take me to him," he said. "Now." Old Tolliver, when they found him, was a shrunken, gray-faced man wrapped in 3 blankets in his nephew's stilt house, still shaking though the storm had passed 4 days gone, and it took very little coaxing and no threat at all, only Charles's quiet, patient questions, before the whole ugly truth came pouring out of him in a guilty rush. Vane's steward had paid him a fat purse to guide the Doomhammer escort into the worst channel in the Delta during the coming storm, under the guise of a shortcut, with strict instructions that the boats were meant only to be delayed and frightened, not drowned. A detail Tolliver clung to with the desperate insistence of a man trying to convince himself he was not a murderer. The purpose, as far as the old boatman understood it, had been to scatter the honor guard entirely, so that none of Ursa's own witnesses would survive the crossing intact enough to compare the treaty scroll they carried against whatever document Vane intended to have signed once the marriage was sealed. "There's more," Tolliver said, his voice cracking. "The steward let slip, drunk one night at the Dock Tavern, that Vane had a second copy of the treaty made. Different terms. Land rights over the whole southern salt flat, terms the old chief never agreed to. Meant to swap it in once the marriage, bound the clan to honor whatever paper bore his seal." He looked up at Charles with something like desperate hope. "I never meant for anyone to drown, Master Fletcher. I swear it on my own soul. When I heard 3 guards were lost, I could not sleep a single night since." Charles left Tolliver's bedside with his heart hammering and his mind racing, and by midday he had the old boatman's confession written out in a shaking hand and witnessed by Jory's uncle. And by that evening, with the help of a sympathetic clerk in the council's own records office, who owed Charles a debt from a mended plow-blade years back, he had found the second copy of the treaty as well, tucked behind a false panel in the records chest, bearing a seal so poorly forged that once you knew to look for the flaw. It screamed its falseness from the page. He brought all of it to Elder Marsh that same night, laying it on the old man's table with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and watched the elder's face go from disbelief to fury as he read. "This changes everything," Marsh said grimly. "If this is true, the trial itself is built on a lie. There will be no honor in it either way, no matter who wins on that platform, if the whole match beneath it was never legitimate." "Then let the truth come out before the fight, not after," Charles said. "Let it come out where the whole town can see it." Elder Marsh looked at him for a long moment, something almost like respect crossing his weathered face. "You've done more digging in 5 days than this council managed in 5 months, he said. "Bring the boatman, bring the clerk. Be on that platform at dawn, Master Fletcher, with every scrap of this in hand. I will see that you are given the chance to speak." Dawn came gray and still over Duskwater Landing. The whole town crowded onto the boardwalks and the surrounding stilt houses to watch the moot platform, where 2 combatants faced each other across sun-bleached planks with the wide brown channel gleaming below on either side. Grath Ironjaw was every bit as massive as the stories had promised, a mountain of scarred green muscle wielding a blade nearly as long as Ursa was tall. And when Elder Marsh called the trial to order, Charles's whole body went cold with a fear he had not let himself feel until this exact moment, standing at the platform's edge with the true blade he had forged tucked, unused, at his own hip, forbidden by the right's rules from interfering once the combat began. Ursa stood across from her opponent in her fitted travel leathers, the same ones she had arrived in, cleaned now, worn now like armor of a different kind, the true steel blade Charles had forged for her grip steady in her hand, and when her eyes found his across the platform, just for one breath before the fight began, something passed between them that needed no words at all. The first exchange was brutal and fast, steel ringing against steel loud enough to echo off the surrounding houses, and Ursa moved like water around Ironjaw's first heavy swing, faster than a man his size expected. But his second blow caught her shoulder, a glancing strike that staggered her back 3 steps, and the crowd gasped as one. Ursa. The name tore out of Charles before he could stop it, and she did not look at him, could not afford to, but something in her stance shifted, steadied, and she came back at Ironjaw with a fury that drove him backward across half the platform, steel flashing, sparks flying where blade met blade. The fight ground on, brutal and close, and twice Charles's heart stopped entirely as Ironjaw's blade came within a hair's breadth of finding her, and twice Ursa turned the strike aside at the very last instant with a speed and a fury that spoke of every hour she had ever spent training in her father's war camps, every insult swallowed in this town, every ounce of fear she had refused to let win. It was Ironjaw's brute strength that finally told, a heavy overhand blow that Ursa caught on her own blade at the wrong angle, and the ceremonial steel, the true blade, forged strong but not tested against a strike so savage, cracked clean through near the hilt, leaving her half a blade and a mercenary twice her size grinning as he raised his weapon for the finishing strike. Now! Charles shouted, and he was already moving, already drawing the second blade from his own hip, the true replacement he had quietly forged in the last 2 nights, hidden until this exact desperate moment because some deep, careful instinct had told him one blade might not be enough, and he threw it, hilt first, the way he had practiced throwing nothing in his life but somehow, impossibly, threw true, and Ursa's hand closed around the grip out of the air a heartbeat before Ironjaw's blade could fall. She turned the killing blow aside with a ringing crash of steel, spun low under the mercenary's overextended arm, and drove the fresh blade up and across in one clean motion that ended the fight without ending a life. Ironjaw's own weapon spinning from his grip to clatter against the planks, the massive orc himself driven to one knee with Ursa's blade resting, unmoving, against the side of his throat. The crowd erupted, but Elder Marsh's voice cut through the noise like a blade of its own. "Hold!" he shouted, striding forward with the confession and the forged treaty clutched in his hand, Charles at his heels. "Hold, all of you. This trial is void before it is even finished." The square went silent, 200 faces turning as one toward the old elder standing at the platform's edge. "I have here," Marsh said, his voice carrying, "the sworn confession of the boatman Tolliver, who admits under witness that he was paid by Silas Vane's own steward to drive the Lady Doomhammer's honor guard into the flood channel that near drowned her, and did drown 3 of her guards. I have here also a second copy of the Delta Treaty, bearing a forged seal, claiming lands and rights the true Chief Brugga Doomhammer never granted. This trial was called by a man who sabotaged the very storm that brought his bride to this town half-dead, in order to force a marriage built on fraud from its very first breath." The crowd's shock broke into an outraged roar, faces that had watched Ursa with suspicion only days before now turning, hot and furious, toward Silas Vane, who stood frozen at the platform's edge with his face gone the color of ash. "Lies," Vane said, but his voice cracked on the word, and the crowd's fury only grew. "There is a witnessed confession, Master Vane," Marsh said coldly, "and a forged seal any clerk in this town can identify at a glance. The council finds this betrothal void, this trial void, and the Lady Doomhammer's honor never once in question, save by the false accusation of the man who nearly drowned her to secure it." Vane's composure shattered entirely then. He lunged not toward Ursa, but toward Charles, a hidden dagger flashing suddenly from his sleeve, driven by nothing but pure animal fury at having lost everything in the space of a single accusation, and the crowd screamed as he closed the distance in 2 frantic strides. Ursa moved faster. She caught his wrist mid-strike with the same crushing grip she had used on the market foreman days before, twisted it hard enough to send the dagger spinning across the planks, and drove her shoulder into his chest with such force that Vane staggered backward across the weakened boards near the platforms, edge boards already cracked and strained from the fight, from the storm damage never fully repaired. And with a groan of splitting timber, a whole section of the moot platform gave way beneath him, dropping him with an undignified splash into the shallow brown channel below, sputtering and flailing amid the wreckage of broken planking, while the entire town of Duskwater Landing dissolved into laughter and jeers above him. Charles reached Ursa in 3 strides, checking the shallow cut on her shoulder with hands that would not stop shaking now that the danger had finally, truly passed, and she caught his face between her palms. Breathless, blood and river mud streaked across her cheek, and she was laughing, helpless and bright and entirely unguarded, the sound of it startling him nearly as much as the fight itself had. "Look at him," she managed, between breaths, nodding down at Vane thrashing in the wreckage below while 2 of the town's guardsmen waded in, entirely unhurried, to haul him out and clap him in irons. 10 years I dreamed of striking that man down, and I never once dreamed the platform would do half the work for me. Charles laughed too then, unable to help it, the fear and the relief and the sheer absurd triumph of it all breaking loose at once, and he pulled her into his arms right there on the broken, splintered boards, in front of the whole cheering, astonished town, and kissed her soundly, and she kissed him back just as fiercely, and neither of them cared one bit who was watching. "I told you," he said against her mouth, "you weren't going to lose. You did not tell me the platform would try to drown my false betrothed for good measure," she said, grinning now, wide and unguarded and utterly beautiful in the morning light. "I begin to think this town suits me better than I first believed." Elder Marsh, picking his way carefully around the broken boards, cleared his throat with the ghost of a smile tugging at his gray beard. "The council will need statements from you both," he said, "and there is the matter of returning word to Chief Brugha Doomhammer and seeing to poor Vane's rather thorough disgrace. But I believe," he added, glancing at where Charles and Ursa stood still wrapped around each other amid the wreckage, entirely unbothered by any of it, "that some matters can wait until after breakfast." The town of Duskwater Landing spent that whole day in a strange, giddy uproar, councilmen scrambling to draft honest apologies to send north with the true treaty terms, guardsmen escorting a still-sputtering Silas Vane to the town's small stone lockup, to await a magistrate from the river capital, townsfolk who had thrown fish heads and muttered slurs only days before now lining the boardwalks to watch Ursa Doomhammer pass with something closer to awe than suspicion in their eyes. And through all of it, Charles Fletcher walked at her side and did not once let go of her hand. Word reached the Delta 3 weeks later, carried by a Doomhammer rider who arrived not with war banners but with a simple, sealed letter from Chief Brugha himself, and Ursa read it twice over by the forge fire before she trusted herself to speak the contents aloud. "My father says," she told Charles, her voice unsteady in a way he had rarely heard from her, "that a treaty built on fraud was never his true bargain, and that a daughter who fought her own trial and won her own freedom has earned the right to choose her own road forward, whatever road that may be. He says," she stopped, cleared her throat, tried again. "He says he remembers a foolish smith's boy from 10 summers past, and that he had wondered more than once over the years whether he had been wrong to forbid it." Charles set down the blade he'd been polishing, crossed the workshop, and took the letter gently from her hands, reading it himself in the warm firelight, a chieftain's careful, dignified blessing, hard-won and long overdue, granting his daughter leave to bind herself to whomever she chose, treaty or no treaty, so long as the bond was true. "He's inviting us north," Charles said, "for the proper right if we want it. Do you want it?" Ursa asked, and there was something almost shy in the question, startling on a woman who had faced down a mercenary twice her size without flinching. "I want whatever keeps you standing in this doorway every morning," Charles said. "Whether that's a clan right in the high country or nothing more than the 2 of us and a boat down the Delta channels, I don't much care which. I only care that it's you." She crossed the room and kissed him, slow and certain. No storm outside now, No danger waiting on any platform. Only the steady warmth of the forge and the quiet, settled peace of two people who had finally, after everything, found their way back to each other for good. A season later, on a mild evening when the delta had gone gold and green with early autumn, and the worst of the flood scars had softened under new reed growth, Duskwater Landing gathered once more on the moot platform, repaired now, sturdier than before, with fresh timber pale against the weathered old planks, not for a trial this time, but for a binding. There was no grand ceremony, no forged treaty, no watchful councilmen weighing political advantage. There was only Ursa Doomhammer in her same fitted travel leathers, cleaned and oiled and mended with her own careful hands, a small clan token from her father's own belt now worked into her belt buckle alongside the old hammer sigil, and Charles Fletcher beside her in his good linen shirt, the small claiming mark at his throat long since healed into a faint, permanent scar he touched sometimes without noticing he did it. Elder Marsh spoke a few simple words, as was the town's custom, and then stepped back to let Ursa speak her own clan's vows, low and fierce and steady, her hand wrapped tight around Charles's own, and when he answered her in turn plain words, honest words, a smith's words, promising steady hands and a warm forge and a heart that had never once, in 10 long years or 10 more to come, belonged to anyone but her. The whole gathered town erupted into cheering loud enough to carry clean across the delta channels. Afterward, standing together at the platform's edge as the sun sank gold and low over the marsh grass, Ursa laughed softly and leaned her head against Charles's shoulder, watching the same channel that had nearly drowned her months before now glowing calm and quiet in the fading light. "You handed me a towel before you said a word," she said, remembering. "I have thought of that more than once since. Any other man might have asked 100 questions first." "Didn't need to ask anything," Charles said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I already knew who you were the moment I saw your face. The rest just took a little longer to catch up." 10 years longer, she said, but there was no bitterness left in it at all, only warmth, only certainty, only the steady, unshakable peace of a woman who had finally, fully come home. 10 years longer, he agreed, and worth every single one of them to end up right here. She turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and warm and sure, with the whole town's cheerful noise fading into a happy blur around them, and neither one of them needed another word at all.